The first time I finished The Final Empire, I closed the book and thought I understood what had just happened. A crew of thieves, an impossible heist, a revolution that shouldn't have worked but did. And at the center of it, one of the most magnetic characters Brandon Sanderson has ever written. A man who smiled in the dark, who laughed at things that should have broken him, who told people they could do the impossible, and then died before he got to see if he was right. I thought Kelsier's plan was about freeing the Skaa. I was wrong. Not entirely wrong, but wrong in the way that matters. Wrong about what the plan actually was, what it was really designed to do, and most importantly, what Kelsier actually understood about his own death that nobody around him, not Doxin, not Breeze, not even Vin, fully grasped until it was already over. Because here's the thing nobody tells you when you pick up Mistborn for the first time: Kelsier wasn't running a heist. He wasn't leading a revolution. He was doing something considerably more dangerous and considerably more deliberate than either of those things. And once you see it, once you understand what he was actually building and why every single piece of the plan was load-bearing in a way the surface reading completely misses, it changes not just how you read The Final Empire, but how you read everything Sanderson wrote about this world afterward. So today, we're going deep on Kelsier, the real plan, the one underneath the plan. The one he never fully explained to his crew because some of it he couldn't explain without the whole thing falling apart. Let's go. Before we can talk about what the plan actually was, we need to be precise about what most readers think it was. Because the surface reading isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. And the gap between the surface and what's underneath is where everything interesting lies. On the surface, Kelsier's plan is a heist dressed as a revolution. He assembles a crew of the most talented thieves, con artists, and allomancers he can find. He sets them to work, undermining the Lord Ruler's power from multiple angles simultaneously, stealing the adium from Cretic Shaw, destabilizing the economy, turning the noble houses against each other, and quietly arming and training a Skaa rebellion that will rise when the moment is right. The stated goal: collapse the Final Empire, free the Skaa, kill the Lord Ruler. And when you're reading it for the first time, that's exactly what it looks like. Kelsier gives the rousing speeches. He trains Vin. He runs the jobs. He is, by every visible metric, a man executing a very complicated, very dangerous plan to liberate an enslaved people. But there's a problem with this reading. And it's a problem Kelsier himself was aware of before the plan ever started. The plan, as stated, doesn't work. Here's the detail I want you to sit with for a moment. Kelsier is not naive. He is the only person in the history of the Final Empire to escape the pits of Hathsin. He survived something that killed everyone else who ever went there. He came back from it with his allomantic powers unlocked and a clarity about the Lord Ruler that none of his crew possessed. A personal, bone-deep understanding of what the Final Empire actually was and what it would take to break it. And he knows, going in, that the Skaa rebellion cannot win in a conventional sense. Think about what he's working with. The Skaa have been enslaved for 1,000 years. 1,000 years of systematic dehumanization, of having every uprising crushed before it could draw breath, of being conditioned from birth to believe that the Lord Ruler is a god, and that resistance is not just futile but cosmically wrong. They don't have weapons. They don't have organization. They don't have a military tradition or experienced commanders or any reason rooted in their lived experience to believe that things could be different. Kelsier knows this. He says it directly at multiple points. He tells his crew that the Skaa need to believe before they'll fight. Not be armed, not be organized. Believe, and then he keeps going. He keeps running the plan that he knows, in his bones, won't produce a sustainable revolution through conventional means. Why? Because the conventional plan was never the real plan. This is where it gets interesting. Early in The Final Empire, Kelsier says something that most readers clock as characterization. As the kind of thing Kelsier says because he's Kelsier, charismatic and slightly unhinged and prone to grand statements. He says, "I'm going to become a legend." And then he smiles, and the scene moves on, and most readers file it under Kelsier being Kelsier. It isn't. It's the thesis statement of the entire plan. What Kelsier understood, and I think he understood this more completely than he ever articulated to anyone around him, is that the Lord Ruler's power wasn't primarily military. Yes, the obligators controlled commerce and record-keeping. Yes, the Steel Ministry had the Inquisitors. Yes, the Final Empire had armies, but none of that was the foundation. The foundation was belief. The Lord Ruler had constructed an entire cosmology around his own divinity. He was the sliver of infinity. He had defeated the deepness and saved the world. He was eternal and unkillable, and the natural order of existence itself. The Skaa didn't just fear him the way you fear a king. They had been told, for 1,000 years, that to even want a different world was a kind of blasphemy. You cannot defeat that with swords. You cannot defeat that with adium or allomancy, or a treasury raid, or even by killing the Lord Ruler himself. Because if the Lord Ruler dies and nothing has changed in the minds of the Skaa, the machinery of the Empire just finds someone else to put in the seat. And 1,000 years of conditioning reasserts itself. Kelsier saw this, and he understood that the only thing that could actually break it was a counter-mythology. Not a better army, a better story. The Skaa didn't need a general. They needed a god of their own. I want you to think about what I'm saying here, because I think it's one of the most audacious things any character in modern fantasy has ever actually done. Kelsier built his plan around his own martyrdom, not as a last resort, not as a contingency, as the mechanism. Every piece of the visible plan, the heist, the crew, the rebellion training, all of it was the scaffolding. The real structure underneath was this: Kelsier was going to make himself into something the Skaa had never had. A figure who was one of them, who suffered what they suffered, who was supposed to be broken and wasn't, who stood up against the God King and died for it, and who, in dying, became impossible to kill. Because that's what martyrs are. That's what martyrdom does to a story. A living revolutionary can be captured, can be discredited, can recant, can age, can fail. A dead revolutionary who died at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, becomes permanent, becomes myth, becomes the kind of story that doesn't need an army behind it because it lives in the chest of every person who hears it. The Skaa needed to believe the Lord Ruler could be defied. Kelsier couldn't give them that as a living man, because living men can be stopped. But a man who looked the Lord Ruler in the eye and chose to die rather than submit, that man becomes something else entirely. Kelsier understood this, and he walked into it clear-eyed. There's a scene, and I want to be careful here, because the weight of it lands differently once you know what you're looking at, where Kelsier is talking to Vin about the plan, and he says that the Skaa need a belief more than they need a leader, and Vin doesn't fully understand what he means. She thinks he's talking about morale, about giving people confidence. He isn't. He's describing the mechanics of his own death and what it will produce. That is not a normal thing to put in a fantasy novel. That is Brandon Sanderson operating at a level of character construction that genuinely unsettles me when I sit with it too long. Here's the piece of the plan that I think gets most consistently misread, and it might be the most important piece of all. The conventional reading of Kelsier and Vin's relationship is mentor and student. Kelsier finds an untrained girl with extraordinary allomantic potential. He trains her, she grows, he dies, she carries on his work. It's a clean arc, it's emotionally satisfying. It's also only partially true. Vin wasn't just Kelsier's student. She was his proof of concept. Think about what Vin represents in the context of the Skaa mythology Kelsier was building. She is a Skaa girl, half Skaa, born with no reason to believe she could be anything other than what the Final Empire told her she was. She's been abused, she's been conditioned to distrust everything. She exists at the very bottom of a society specifically designed to grind people like her into nothing. And she is one of the most powerful allomancers alive. Kelsier found her and recognized immediately what she was. Not just as a weapon, but as a symbol. If a Skaa girl from the streets of Luthadel could become this, then what did that say about what the Lord Ruler had been telling the Skaa about themselves for 1,000 years? What did it say about the nature of their oppression? Kelsier trained her because she needed training. But he also trained her in publicly within the crew, in ways that made her impossible to ignore. He put her in noble society. He put her in the most dangerous situations. He made sure that by the time his part of the plan was over, Vin was not a secret. She was a fact about the world that couldn't be undone. And then he died, and he left her standing, a Skaa Mistborn. Still there. Still breathing. Proof that the story the Lord Ruler had been telling was a lie. You cannot overstate what that means as a piece of mythological construction. Kelsier didn't just die as a martyr. He died having already installed his replacement symbol. The story doesn't end with him. It continues, embodied, present, impossible to dismiss. That's not a mentor training a student. That's an architect making sure the building doesn't fall when he leaves. I want to pause on something that I find genuinely uncomfortable in the best possible way. Kelsier's crew didn't fully know Dogson, who had been with him for years, Breeries, the most perceptive manipulator in Luthadel. Ham, clubs, spook, none of them understood the complete architecture of what Kelsier was doing, because Kelsier couldn't tell them. And the reason he couldn't tell them is chilling when you think it through. If the crew knew that the real plan ended with Kelsier's death, that his martyrdom was not a risk but a requirement, they would have tried to prevent it. Not because they were weak, but because they were human. Because they loved him. Because Dogson had followed him for years, and Vin had started to trust him for the first time in her life, and the entire emotional architecture of the crew was built around Kelsier being the irreplaceable center. If they knew, they would have changed the plan. They would have found another way, or tried to. And any other way would have produced a living Kelsier and a failed revolution, because the revolution needed what only a dead Kelsier could provide. So he held it back. He ran the visible plan. He gave them the heist, the objectives, the piece they could execute. He let them believe they were running a revolution when they were actually participating in the construction of a religion. And then he walked into the courtyard and he let the Lord Ruler kill him in front of everyone. The man who escaped the pits of Hathsin, the only person who ever escaped the pits of Hathsin, chose not to escape this. That was the plan. Let's look at what Kelsier's death actually did in the days and weeks that followed, because this is where the architecture becomes visible. The Skaa had been watching. The Skaa were always watching. They had no power, so watching was what they did, cataloging everything, looking for cracks. And what they saw was this. A man they had started to whisper about, a man who had become a rumor and then a story and then something larger, had stood in the center of Luthadel and defied the Lord Ruler to his face, had been killed for it, had smiled. The Lord Ruler killed him, and the sky didn't fall, and no divine punishment rained down on everyone who had known him. It was just a man dying. But the manner of it, the choice of it, the refusal to run, the smile, turned the death into exactly what Kelsier needed it to become. The Skaa didn't see a defeat. They saw a proof. They saw that you could look the God King in the eye, that he could kill your body, but he couldn't kill the fact that you looked. The rebellion that rose afterward wasn't organized by Kelsier. He was already dead. It rose because the story had reached critical mass, because the impossible thing had happened not once but twice. A man defied the Lord Ruler and died, and then a Skaa girl destroyed his inquisitors, and the Lord Ruler fell. Kelsier designed the first half. Vin delivered the second. Together, they were a complete mythology. The martyr who showed defiance was possible. The heir who showed it was sustainable. The final empire didn't fall because of the Adium, or the treasury, or the armies. It fell because the story the Lord Ruler had been telling for 1,000 years stopped being believable. That was always the target. I want to end on something that I have thought about more than is probably healthy. There's a question lurking underneath everything I've described. And it's this. How much did Kelsier know? Because there's a version of this where Kelsier is a brilliant revolutionary who intuited that martyrdom would be more useful than survival and executed accordingly. That reading is already extraordinary. That reading already makes him one of the most interesting characters in modern fantasy. But there's another version. Kelsier had been to the pits of Hathsin. He had seen things there, experienced things there, that changed him in ways he never fully explained to anyone. He came back different. He came back with a clarity that felt, to the people around him, almost supernatural. He came back knowing, with a certainty that he never seemed to need to defend, that what he was doing was right, not strategically right. Cosmically right, like a man who has been shown something true about the world and is now just working backward to make it visible to everyone else. I'm not going to say more than that, because this is a video about the final empire, and I am not going to be the person who spoils what happens later in this world, but I will say this. The plan Kelsier ran was almost too perfect. The way it accounted for variables that a normal person running a heist wouldn't think to account for. The way his death produced exactly the right mythology at exactly the right moment. The way Vin was positioned exactly correctly to be both the continuation and the proof. Either Kelsier was the most naturally gifted mythological architect who ever lived, or he had help seeing what he needed to build. Either way, what he did with that knowledge is one of the most remarkable things I've encountered in this genre. He turned his own death into a weapon. He aimed that weapon at 1,000 years of enforced belief. And he pulled the trigger himself, smiling, knowing exactly what he was doing. The plan was never about the Skaa. It was about the story. The Skaa told themselves about what was possible. And Kelsier understood that if you change the story, you change everything. So the next time you read The Final Empire, and if this video has done what I wanted it to do, you're going to want to reread it. Watch Kelsier differently. Watch what he doesn't explain. Watch where he's generous with information and where he's careful. Watch the moments where he seems to be performing for an audience that isn't in the room. Watch him with Vin and ask yourself whether that's a mentor talking or an architect checking whether the load-bearing wall is solid. And when you get to the courtyard, when you get to the moment where he could run and doesn't, you'll know he wasn't trapped. He was exactly where he planned to be. If you want to go deeper on what this world looks like underneath the surface, and I promise you, there are layers here that would make Kelsier himself smile. Let me know in the comments which thread you want to pull next. I read all of them. Until next time.